Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fourth and final Summer Cool Sessions for Creatives. My name is Lydia Thompson, and I am Chair of the Department of Art and Art History. Since March of this year, we have been dealing with the impact and ramifications of the coronavirus, which have changed our lives forever. The UNCC community strongly supports and encourages our students to remain focused on their educational goals during these unprecedented times. The Department of Art and Art History, in partnership with the University Career Center, has created the Summer Cool Sessions for Creatives. This series will introduce you to professional creatives in diverse fields in the industry and reboot your energy levels to expand your potential and what is possible as you develop your career goals and build your network. Before I begin, I just wanted to share a couple of comments regarding the impact of art on society. As a practicing professional artist myself, I believe the creative process has always been at the center of my universe, and I, as well as others, experience how art and art history continues to evoke intellectual thought. It's used for problem solving, a vehicle for understanding other cultures, contextualizing diverse political and social viewpoints, and more importantly, art enhances our world. For your information, in the National Endowment for the Arts study, March of 2019 report stated the arts contributed more than $760 billion to the US economy. And in 2016, the North Carolina Arts Council reported that nonprofit arts and culture alone consist of a $2 billion industry. Our last three sessions provided examples of how art is utilized in the health professions to heal patients, and our second session provided information on your footprint in public commercial. And thirdly, our third presentation really focused more about art in the military. We've seen firsthand how art can transform a culture, as well as witnessing firsthand with the Black Lives Matter protests and movement how it can help shape our viewpoint and expand our education on a particular culture. It is my hope that the world will continue to evolve and find solutions to equality and equity for all. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to thank both Dr. Suzanne Boyd, Associate Director and Career Coach, and Mr. A.J. Simmons, Assistant Professor and Career Coach, for their administrative and technical support for this program. Dr. Boyd will serve as our moderator for today's presentation. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Ms. Jonell Logan. She is an independent curator, arts advocate, and the executive director of the League of Creative Interventionists, which is a nonprofit organization that provides resources to artists and emerging community leaders in their neighborhoods. She founded this organization, founded 300 Arts Project LLC. It's an arts management and consulting firm. She is also author of This is Remix, which is an essay published that accompanied the exhibition titled Remix, Themes and Variations in African American Art exhibition at the Columbia Museum of Art in Columbia, South Carolina. This essay can be found at the Columbia Art Museum Resource Library. Ms. Logan, thank you so much for joining us today and your willingness to share information about how artists can successfully include social and political commentary while maintaining their voices in a rigorous artistic practice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. So I think we can, I would love to have a really informal kind of conversation, just so we can all kind of like check in with each other and really talk through this process and some of the ideas that kind of come around, this idea of balancing your creative practice with making statements. And I think we're in this moment right now where that is critical and difficult. I don't think that any of us, the idea of bringing politics and culture and making statements in work is something that has happened throughout human history. And then even probably in the past 5 years, we've seen an increase in this type of work. But I don't think anybody was ready for this. And so, as people are like really struggling to think about how to express themselves and how to incorporate their creative practice, you know, there are things that I think work, and then there are things that we could probably push ourselves as a collective to do more and to think differently about. So, ask questions along the way. This should really be a conversation and like an intimate conversation. So, hop in where you feel you fit in, and whatever your thoughts are, just let me know. So, I guess we can kind of start going through some of the slides. And so, one of the things that is difficult sometimes is to talk about this idea of artistic rigor, right? And as students and people who are going through the academy to really learn how to craft your fine art practice, there's a lot of conversation about rigor. But then also, I think in the field, there is this breakdown or this space where rigor and social practice and social commentary don't often meet. And so Rigor is an artist. I don't talk about this often, but I'm trained as a printmaker, a lithographer particularly. I have worked in museums a lot. And so museum education and curation, right? So these two kind of practices come together, and rigor and artistic practice are super important to me. So when we talk about artistic rigor, some of the things that I think about and look for in work is, are you remaining true to your artistic voice? Sometimes when we're making comments about things, we adapt or adopt other people's perspectives and style because it might be familiar to people, or it seems like it has worked. And so we kind of take that and integrate that into the work that we're doing. But are you pushing yourself as an artist? Are you being true to who you are creatively in order to continue or to question these ideas that you're really trying to investigate? This one is so important to me. Does the piece work as a work of art, right? So formally, does it work? In terms of practice, does it work? And then does it make a statement? So are those two things happening concurrently? Because if they're not, then there's a question of rigor, right? And we have to, I think, evaluate, like, why are we doing it this way? Because there's plenty of space to create work that works and to make a statement. Can you talk about the work beyond what it's about? Sometimes creatives get so kind of caught in the subject that they forget to be able to talk about it in a larger practice, in a larger framework. And so really making sure as you're making work that you can do both. Can you talk about the statement, but can you also connect that to your practice? Can you also talk about it as an artist? Can it function as a work of art? And then are you questioning or presenting new ideas? So I personally believe that the artistic practice is an opportunity to create a new perspective, to ask questions, to move us beyond where we were before. And so when we talk about these things, are you in your work questioning or presenting new ideas? Because if we're still, part of the creative kind of investigation, right, is moving things forward, presenting new ideas, rethinking concepts. And so if that's not happening, are we really being successful in this work? So I have some examples of artists that I think are doing some of that. And I'd love to talk about it. Like, we can talk about like folks and what they're doing. They're three different people from three different perspectives. And two, I'm looking at public art, and one looking at an artist who is doing work for herself, because I think that consistency has to happen, whether this is a piece that's going to be installed on a plaza somewhere or work that you are creating, for, let's say, a traditional installation, or just exploring kind of internal ideas. So can we look at the next slide? So I just put that there because we've all seen it recently. And there's a lot of, I think, interesting dialogue that's happening around the murals that are happening on the street. One is a question of impact. So is this about system, does this create an opportunity for systems change? And can art do that? I think it's possible for art to do that, but we can talk about that later. But then also really kind of looking at these murals have appeared in different cities, kind of what the intention was behind them and how they've kind of invited artists to participate in the process. So in Charlotte, each letter, an artist kind of took on each letter and created each one. In other cities, you know, they had a combination of artists and volunteers just kind of painted in yellow. And so it's just kind of interesting that this phenomenon is happening around the country and that there's starting to be this kind of conversation about where does it lead to, what is next, is it impactful? And I totally encourage dialogue around those questions because it means that people are thinking, it means that people, it's being a prompt for people to think about what comes next. So I think, can you go to the next one? So there are three folks that I'm going to talk about. The first is Kehinde Wiley. Do y'all know Kehinde Wiley's work? I'm sure, right? So yes, no, maybe. Okay, so to run through a little bit about Kehinde. Kehinde is, okay, Lydia said yes. Oh, awesome. Okay, so Kehinde is a painter. He's relatively young. I think he's of Nigerian background. Is painting in the States. And he really kind of was interested in reclaiming art history and placing people of color in this art historical context, right? Because if you look at the work that is championed by art history, oftentimes people of color and Black people in particular are absent. And so as a Black man, it was important for him to really think about the language of art history, right? And then taking that language and associating it with people that he knew and could see in the street, or people that were kind of recognized figures that kind of represent Blackness, right? That are part of the dynamic. And so you can see two images. The one on my left is of Ice-T. So you can tell the difference between Ice-T and Napoleon. So wherever they are on the screen for you. So his painting of Kehinde, Ice-T on one side, and then Napoleon on his imperial throne on the other. And so he really kind of is borrowing tropes of power, what it looks like, how we in the West have defined power, who we value in art history, and kind of transposing that in with members of the Black community. And so he has this history of doing that. And he's done paintings, which he's most well known for. He did do the presidential portrait of Obama. And so a lot of people have seen his work and know his work from that. But he has this entire history of really reclaiming cultural presence and celebrating Black cultural practice in his work. So just keep that in mind, like he has this tradition. And then can we go to the next slide? And he takes that and translates it into this piece that was done last year. It's actually a public sculpture. It's called Rumors of War. This installation was the first installation in Richmond, Virginia. And what he's done, and we've all been seeing a lot about these, what is the word? I know it. Confederate, I almost forgot it. Confederate monuments that have been removed because, you know, of the racist history of the Confederacy. And so he's actually taken, this was inspired by an actual statue. He's changed the figure to be a Black man, a young Black man on horseback in his very traditional pose that we all can recognize and read. And he's talking a lot about the absence, right? The exclusion of young Black men from a lot of the political dialogue. And so it's a way, like he's borrowing this language that we are familiar with, and it's really kind of subversive to allow for this other kind of conversation. Now, you know, there's varying kind of positions, whether people think it's effective, But I think a lot of that is, one, if you don't know who he is, when you experience the work, right, you know the context that you expect. And then once you face it, you're completely confronted with something else. So then that fosters kind of this thought about, like, what is this really about? How is this here? You know, you see the mirroring between this figure and the original kind of statue. And so there's a lot of kind of dynamic and push that happens. And so when we talk about artistic rigor, I think, you know, he has built up this practice of borrowing Western language and translating it and transforming it into something that represents people who are often excluded. And so this really kind of interesting kind of work that he's doing. So the next person we'll look at, I think, is Ai Weiwei. Yes. So Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist who is a contemporary artist, but then also a lot of his work has to do with activism. And he's done a lot of work that has spoken out against the Chinese government. As a result, his studio has been raided and razed before. And so he really, and what's interesting, I think, about his work is he really takes risks and pushes the dynamic to a space where people often feel uncomfortable. And so this piece, these actually are life vests. I think there's 14,000. So with him, volume is really important. If you look at a lot of his work, he does lots of multiples, and volume is important. And in his installations, when you have a lot of volume, when it takes over space, it forces the person to kind of reconsider their power and context in space, right? And so 14,000 life vests were collected off of Lesbos in Greece. These are actually vests that people wore when they were attempting to come from Europe, come to Europe from Turkey. And so they're all hung. This installation in particular is in Berlin. And he's talking, you know, it's an interesting way, right? It's a very physical, tangible, visual way to talk about the refugee situation, which is often really kind of theoretical, because a lot of us don't see the refugees that are attempting to, you know, to come to the West. We don't experience until, like, especially in this country, until people have passed through filter after filter after filter, right? We don't understand that process. We don't experience it. And so this is a real kind of visual way to address that. And so it's really, he's looked at the refugee issue a lot in his work, and looks at how to physically affect us as a viewer. Can you look at the next, can we go to the next slide? These are two other examples of his work. And I'll start with the one that is on the, I hope it's the building with the vest again. So it's on the right for me. Those are the same vests, but are then kind of installed on the windows of this space. And the idea that this is called sunrise, and all of the sunlight is being blocked inside the building by the vest. And so what I like about this is that it's taking that same material, right, the life vest, and completely transforming the way that they're installed in relationship to space. And so when we talk about artistic rigor and we think about process, it would be really easy to attempt to install the piece again the same way, because it worked. But this really, you know, having the practice to think about placement, to think about how do I create the same statement, but affect a different community in a way that would be most impactful, is part of what he's doing. And so, and there are other installations of the vest in different kind of frameworks, depending on where it is. And then he got in trouble for the image on the left. You all remember, unfortunately, a few years ago, there was that image of the Syrian boy who had drowned in an attempt to make it to Greece. And so Ai Weiwei recreated that image. And it brought a lot of criticism of his work or of him as an artist. But it's still, he has always, as an artist, kind of challenged the power structure and kind of community norms in order to make a statement. And so you have this body of work that's questioning the refugee issue, right? You have this body of work that is really thinking about the physical manifestations of this whole kind of migration of people from one place to the other. And then you have him committing to using his body in this image in a way I am sure that he knew would kind of push people's buttons and really gain a lot of criticism, but it also created a lot of awareness because people who totally are not into the art world were talking about this image. And so it's this commitment and this other way of kind of pushing the dialogue forward. And then we can look at the last artist, Jodie Bieber. I have worked with Jodie before. She is a South African photographer, a white South African photographer. She did a series of work that I did not include in this that was looking at women who are in South African jails, particularly because they either assaulted or killed a man who was physically abusing them. And so, unfortunately, the murder rate for women in South Africa is incredibly high. It's an epidemic of physical violence against women. And so for Jodie, after kind of going through this process and looking at work and talking with women who are incarcerated, one of the issues that came up was this idea of toxic masculinity and this image that like men have to be powerful and violent. And so what she did was to create this series called Quiet. And in this work, she went to the homes of different men and encouraged them to be quiet, right? So this idea of relaxation, this idea of repose, this idea of letting all of that kind of public bravado that may be had to let that go. And so for this project, and she talked about it kind of really being difficult, she would actually sit with people for hours sometimes until they could completely relax themselves. And then she created this kind of series of images of men in their personal spaces in this quiet space. And what's interesting is that oftentimes, you know, there are artists who kind of challenge the notion of masculinity, but she's doing it in a way that is very intimate and very personal so that we're able to see each man as an individual and kind of going against that idea of like the definition of masculinity. But then also like really committing to the process. And so it's interesting. There's a play between art history here as well. There is actually, if we can switch to the next slide, you know, the figure, these are two images that we often would see women in art history kind of in these positions. And so she's really kind of playing with this notion of what is masculinity? How do we enter into space? What is this concept of power? And what is really interesting is that people really, I've seen people really respond to these images in ways that they would normally kind of pass them by. Because they're very personal, because they're very intimate, and they're really beautiful. And when we think about men in images, we often don't say the word beautiful. It might be powerful, it might be aesthetically pleasing, it might be dynamic, but this idea of beauty and integrating beauty into this space was something that was really important to her. And so what I love about this series is that it connects completely to another series of work that she's doing that explores kind of, you know, women in prison and the idea of physical abuse against women. But here it's not just images of either battered women or, you know, the men that might kind of give off this energy, but it's this idea that if this is an issue, how can I take that and rotate it so that people can see other options, people can see the humanity in themselves, we can shift this dynamic around what power looks like and encourage people to kind of operate in a different space. And so I really, really kind of love her work because of that. When we talk about, this kind of idea of, again, of practice, right? It's considering and rethinking your practice as an individual. It's considering and rethinking the practice of photography, because oftentimes when we look at photographs that kind of explore, violence, they actually use images of violence or the legacy of violence. And she completely switches that so that it becomes not only positive, but a reflection of humanity. So those are the three artists that I was like, okay, who would I want to talk about? I am totally like, I would love to like hear what you guys are thinking and questions that you might have. Yeah, I've talked a lot. I'd love to hear what other people think.
Well, I would like to get the questions going, Jonell, just by asking, how do you as a curator work with the artist to help their message and their concept fully come alive within the space that they envision?
So I think I work in two ways. So I'll start when I curate. When I curate, while I might have a vision in mind, I see it as a collaboration with the artist. So I might ask for particular work. I might like go to the studio and find things that I really like and that speaks to kind of the overarching concept. But I really see this as an opportunity for us to work together. And I kind of feel like, and this has only started to process in my mind because of my art background, like I see my exhibitions as kind of creative spaces and creative installations, almost like a work of art. So it becomes this kind of collaborative thing where we're working together to create this ultimate piece. And so, I'll often ask artists, I'm thinking about this work. What work do you want to show? What have you been working on lately? Because I like to see the evolution, and there might be like an older piece and a newer piece that can come together. And like, what do they really want to get out of being in this? So I'm curating a show now, and one of the things that I asked the artist is, this is the overarching theme. This is your work that's going to be included. Who else do you think might be interesting in partnership with your work? And so we were able to have a really great conversation, and a couple of those people actually are now in the exhibition. When it comes to working with artists like one-on-one, I think it's important to ask some of the tough questions, because I look at stuff a lot and really encourage artists to kind of go and look and explore. And like, I always ask, who do you like? I also often ask, who don't you like and why? And so, like, I think of it as a relationship. So
Thank you so much. I'd love to open it up to the students if you guys have any questions. And again, feel free to put your questions in the chat or just turn on your microphone.
yeah, just ask me. Don't say.
So my question is, first off, thank you for today and speaking about the process of creating. And throughout what you were saying, there was this interesting thing with each artist. It's a continuation of the work and the topics that they're doing, and how they juxtapose ideas with with something else. So when you're talking about violence, specifically, I have this body of work and it's violent, and I want to show it in a new light to transform it. How would you express or showcase or juxtapose violence to the abuse of a people? Yeah.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think the format, it depends on partially the format. So, and really identifying the format that works well. Oftentimes, I'm concerned that artists just kind of see one way of presenting their work, and we're living in a moment where there are so many options. Is it work that should be in a traditional art space? Is it work that should go be in and in partnership with smaller organizations that are really nimble and really flexible and aren't afraid? Because honestly, sometimes larger institutions, are afraid to show work that's challenging. They have funders to worry about, they have board members to worry about, they're worried about their reputation. And so, like, where is the best space? Is it something that should be like pop up on the street and then people like have to think about it and then it disappears, right? Is it permanent? Does the statement have to be permanent? Can the statement evolve? I think those are some things to consider. And then, of course, the online space, I think, is something that is an option. I think if, as an artist, you kind of know the context and where you think it fits best, it helps people like me support, like, how do you show the work, and can say, okay, well, if you think the work should be here, let's consider these list of organizations who may not even be local to this space, but are already having some of those like conversations and dialogues, or has a history of supporting that kind of work. The other thing I think to think about, and not at all saying that this is about the work that you're talking about, but in general, I think that sometimes there is this level of spectacle that we expect to, like, that we think is needed in order for work to be seen and shown. You know, I'm really interested in like that smart, strategic, like lethal strike work a lot. And so, as you're creating and as anyone is creating and kind of forging into territory that might not be comfortable, I think being smart about it, not safe about it, but smart about like the content, and how you're presenting that content is also really important, because it's hard for people to argue with really smart work, right? It's super easy to just kind of like shut down if something is totally like just difficult or spectacle.
I just wanted to say something, Jonell. I think you're absolutely right. I was in I was going to say I was in Columbus, Ohio, but I'm still in Columbus, Ohio. I've been going back and forth, but and driving down one of the main corridors of the city, which is High Street, where there was the protested Black Lives Matter protests, and there were a lot of the plywood that was nailed on all the businesses, and really beautiful murals. So the murals were not always about violence. They were just about love. So I think it brought in a different kind of dialogue with Black Lives Matter, although you had the looting and everything. But what was interesting is I think they were saying how they want to take those murals and they want to put them in a gallery or museum. And I'm thinking, okay, so that's going to recontextualize those pieces, just like you were saying about, being smart. Is that what we want? Because they're locked away to a certain extent if you were to put them in a museum, but maybe there's a certain level of validation that happens with that work. But, seeing it every day is a constant visual reminder that we can't let this die. So how do you see like what's even happening in Charlotte? Like, that first slide, or maybe the third slide, when you were talking about public art, Black Lives Matter, what happens after that? Like how important is it for that image to be permanent or some remnants of it?
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. So I think in theory, it's a great piece, right? It's beautiful. It was an opportunity to bring artists together. I think it allowed for people to have conversations that they may not have had. It also allowed a lot of people, and people of color in particular, to engage in the arts in a way that they traditionally do not. I mean, a lot of people don't go uptown to like go to different museums. Uh-oh, I think did my internet slow down? Okay.
No, you're
Okay. I'm always suspect. I think like somebody's playing video games. But it brought people uptown that would normally not go uptown to engage in like creative practice. So I think that's great. My concern with that mural and any mural is it leading to systems change, right? we often present like really good like events, right? So we like make this statement and this thing happens. But ultimately, is it going to change things? And I'm waiting to kind of see if that happens. And so, should it remain? I think it's an important moment in history. So somehow, like whether it's digitally, or like if it stays, I don't know what the practicality of that would be, but I think it marks this real moment in history, and can be a visual reminder of that. And so I think it's important in that way as well.
That's great. And I'm just curious, for your personal career, how did you get into this line of being a curator as well as going into being an independent curator?
So, gosh, it's total. This is gonna sound really cheesy, I think, but it's true. So I think I was supposed to be in the arts forever, like that, right? So my aunt worked for, had a regular job, but then she was also a painter and a photographer. And so, she would like encourage me to like make things and paint and write. And I did that for a long time. I went to Arts High School in New York, where I'm from. And then, I was like,
Yay, alumni.
yeah, yay. And then I was like, oh, I don't know what to do. So I thought I was gonna go and like, I don't know, like at that moment, everybody was like really interested in marine biology. I don't know why. And and I thought that might be what I did. And then I had this internship at City College, and I was like doing these sleep studies and hormone studies on rats, which was like awful because you had to put them down. And then I started having like nightmares about like rats in trench coats. And so I was like, I can't do this anymore. So the department chair got me to sign up for an internship at the Metropolitan Museum. And I've been like going there as a kid, like forever, because my aunt really like, thought it was important. And so I went to like Broadway shows and I went to museums. And when I was there, I learned that one, everybody didn't know it was a museum, right? They thought it was like a post office or whatever, because it like from the front, it had like the formal kind of, you know. And then two, that not a lot of people who look like me were in there. And I was just like, oh, what? So my mission at that moment in high school, this is my like senior year of high school, God, was to create spaces, so that people who look like me and everybody else knew that they had the right to access culture. And so, I worked at the Whitney and the Studio Museum and in the Met in New York. And then it was really, I was like super New York. Like I could tell you like New York, Florida, DC, of course, because everybody can, and California. And I knew nothing about like the rest of like the country. And I was like that chick who was like Jersey is trash and everything else, like New York is like life. So I knew that if I was about making access that I had to leave that. So I moved to Charleston, which was different. And then ultimately came to the Charlotte area. And so for me, like making spaces and being able to totally understand like the cultural exchange that people have with creative spaces was important. So I've been doing this work now like forever. I'm not gonna say like a long time, I'll just put it that way.
Thank you so much. Do any of the students have any questions? Another question I'd just like to ask is, if the student is interested in doing more public art, talk a bit in the first of your presentation about knowing that the work works. How can they get really good feedback from either professors or from curators to make sure that then, like I said, the message in their work is actually working in the space that they hope to put it?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a couple of things. Like if you want to know if the work works, you gotta be totally open to having like that conversation in your studio and like getting real feedback. And I will never forget this. I was in grad school and I thought I was going to be a painter, but I knew I hated color. Hated it. I don't like color. Like, and I really didn't like painting. I love drawing, but to me, I was convinced that I couldn't like draw, right? And so my professor came in to my studio and he looked around, right? And then he was like, "You are not a painter." And I was like, one, oh my God, like, how can you say that to me? And two, that you were totally right, because I hate this stuff anyway, right? And that ultimately led me to what my love was printmaking, in particular lithography, because you can draw. Like, that's the whole process. And so I think like having that uncomfortable conversation and being ready for like all the like feelings that you're gonna have is so important, because it will allow you, one, if you know this person is genuinely interested in your well-being and your development, trust that, right? Two, feel what you gotta feel, right? Mull through that, take a week, whatever it is, and then like build off of those comments, because I think that's really important. Another thing, like if you're really interested in doing public art, there are like some key things that you need to start setting up now in order to be able to qualify for some of these calls that happen. One, you need to know your materials, because there's questions about that. So like, if you are a sculptor and you're trying to do outside work, you need to know kind of like what will rust and what won't, what kind of supports that you'll need below, right? The piece that you're doing, is it going to sit on the ground? Is it going to be elevated? What is that? And what are the materials? So you really have to kind of like connect with material and study that. You have to like have relationships with like other people, because it's often that you're working in concert with an environmental architect, a contractor to do some of the other work. So you have to like start building those networks now. And oftentimes for calls, they'll ask in advance if you have a team. And a lot of people don't like roll up with a team, right? If you're new to this work. So like start to make those relationships. And it's cool because like, there are architectural students like right by you, right? Somewhere, depending on where you're on campus, right? Like you can tap into those folks. Start making those relationships early. Didn't Issa Rae talk about like when you're networking, don't only network up, network sideways, because those are the folks you're going to come up with, right? So start building those relationships now, asking lots of questions now. I would look at calls that are happening, even though you're not going to apply for them, to see what they're asking for, so that you, when you are ready, can be prepared to totally kind of walk in with your, with your relationship, with your team, with your work, and able to answer any questions. And the other thing they look for is, can you manage a budget? And a lot of times we don't talk about that in the art world, right? We talk about the creative process, but you need to like manage your money and be able to present yourself as a business. Otherwise, you will be overlooked. And I've sat on a number of like public grants applications, and I know that these are things that we look for and that we question. And make sure when we're talking about your budget, because you know your materials, right? And because you have your folks that you've like networked with, that you're giving real amounts of money in the budget. So don't say you can make like a piece for this $25,000 call when you know that the actual cost is $75,000, because people will look at you and be like, nope, right? So like just like really know beyond the creative process what is required to make it happen, so that you're ready. Because that's like part of the thing, like you got to be ready. Like we talk about readiness in other disciplines, it's the same thing here.
Hey, I have a
Go ahead.
question, Jonell. This is kind of, because we're recording this, and I think it would be some valuable information. I appreciate what what our discussion is, because it's really important that that we talk about what's happening in the classroom, but we also talk about that profession as well. My question to you is, most of the we only have an undergrad program, so we won't have grad students who will be looking at this. We offer the Bachelor of Fine Arts in Graphic Design and in studio, and then we also have art history, a BA in art history. So when these students look at the videos, these sessions, they're thinking about the next steps. So we know that there's a fair amount of our students that will stay within North Carolina or the region. Some of them will venture out and maybe go to New York or the West Coast or Midwest, where they are right now, how does grad school or even travel, international travel, maybe even a Fulbright or those things, how does that play into their building their career?
Mm-hmm. I think travel is incredibly important. And for a number of reasons. One, it allows you to see things that you would not be able to see in real life where we are. And I think that's so important because there are so many people that have worked through ideas or created really kind of interesting solutions that you just got to experience to really kind of get. It also broadens your network. And so, no lie, was it my first job out of college, I got because I had connected with someone when I was in undergraduate school. And they were like, oh, I know your practice, I know your work. Why don't you apply for this? And so, and that's happened a lot. Like a lot of my professional kind of experience comes from the relationships that I've built with other people. And so I think that's really important. And you never know where you're going to end up. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work on the West Coast. I went to LA. The first time I went to LA, I was like, ugh, I cannot stay in California. And I hate LA because it was not New York. I told you I had an issue. But a lot of the work that I'm doing now is on the West Coast because of like the exchange. And I think seeing some of what's happening in the art world on the West Coast is really interesting. And it's pushing ideas forward. And so, I was able to kind of plug into some of those interests. Before COVID, through some of the work at the League, we were connected to some creative placemakers in England. And we were actually going to do an exchange, but then COVID happened. But we're still kind of talking about how, when all of this is over, we can build this like relationship between people who are in the practice here and people who are in the practice there, because it looks very different. And some of the elements that are happening here could really benefit the work that they're doing, and vice versa. And so I think you have to be open to travel, even if it's not international. Like, the art scene in Atlanta is a little bit different from what's happening here. What's happening in New York is different, like in Texas, and it has a lot of issues right now, but like there's a lot happening in the contemporary art world there. So you have to go. Like, it's not even, I don't think it's an option. Like, you have to see what's happening. And because we're exchanging so much information anyway, and the expectation is that we're a global community, you have to be able to reference these real kind of touch points in order to really kind of play the game and be ready. So I think that that's incredibly important. And if grad school is not your thing, even though I think everyone should go to grad school, I know that, amongst educators, that's fine. Like, but what can you learn from someone else? What can you learn from a residency? What can you learn from like reaching out to one of your like favorite artists and like begging to like come and see what they're doing? Like that is really an important part of your professional kind of growth and development. And so, I'm like, y'all gotta go. Everybody's gotta go.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Fellow LAG alumni.
Yes.
So I am a grad student, and I am not in the visual arts side. I actually graduated with my undergrad in dance, but am pursuing my master's in management, and wanted to know, because I know your work with League of Creative Interventionists, and looked at applying for that fellowship the last time it was open, and just really trying to get a sense of, or your thoughts on someone using that creative piece of them, but really wanting to transition that into more community engaged work, looking into organizations or corporations that are doing more of that CSR work, and kind of what advice would you give for someone trying to make that leap?
So first, let me say the application is reopened yesterday, so you should look at that.
Will do.
Okay, I think I think that transition, one, is important. Two, can be difficult depending on who the person is. I think creativity is so critical in community engagement because basically, okay, full transparency, a lot of the methods that we've been using aren't working, right? Because they're top down. They're not thinking about how do we engage people in community and having dialogue and working together to make this work happen. And oftentimes when we think of creative processes, there is this like space of like thinking and rethinking and negotiating. And so, and there's this element of taking risks that I think is centered in that work. And so I think that it's so important. If you're interested in doing that work, I mean, you know, one, talk to people who are doing that kind of work to kind of see what their process has been, also what some of the pitfalls they've seen are, because that will allow you to kind of navigate around those fairly quickly. I think doing the work, and it doesn't have to be like this massive scale project, right? So like start small, you know, when people were putting up those little like pop-up mailboxes with books in them or like food pantries, you know, that's a creative like way of like addressing a need. We often think that there has to be a lot of dollars behind it, and it doesn't. Like, so I would say start small is something that's important, or just do the work. Not even start small, just do the work, I think is critical. And then the other thing is to look for partnerships, because this work doesn't happen alone. So one of the things we often ask artists who are kind of interested is, who have you worked with before, and how do you see, you'll see one of the questions on our application is, how have you, who could be a potential partner for this? Because you have to be aware of the things that are happening in community already. And none of this work can really happen alone. Like you got, like, there has to be buy-in and you need support. And so, you know, plugging in and connecting with like-minded folks that are doing work, I think is also really important.
That is great. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned a lot of artists getting calls for different projects. Is there a certain place that students and young artists can actually start looking for these opportunities to get involved with public art?
Yeah, so ASC has traditionally, and again, because we're in COVID, traditionally had calls for artists to do public artwork. And so connecting with, like, looking at their calls and kind of seeing what they're doing is really important. There are a number of artists that are here in Charlotte that are doing public work, both at the airport and kind of, I know the airport is a big one, the police stations are a big one, and some of the parks. So I would talk to them, just to be like, hey, I saw, you know, do your little research, find a couple of the artists, reach out to them, see if they're open to having a conversation, and then like meet with them and talk about, so, you know, what did you propose? You know, what were some of the things that you had to work through? You know, what were some of your unforeseen challenges, like in the field? Because like that's the stuff you need to know, like in advance. And then look at that. Also, I would look nationally. There are a number of spaces where you can, you can even Google like calls for public art. And you can look at that and see what they're doing. And then if their administrators are open to having some of the conversations, I would talk to them as well, and say, you know, what do you look for? Why, you know, why this? I know right now well, there were, again, because there was a pause, but there was a lot around kind of cultural legacy that was happening. So, you know, checking in with that. I think those are like the key things to kind of start, you know, navigating that field. Because if you have the information in advance, even if you have questions later on, it allows you to ask better questions. And with better questions, you know, I think if you call that administrator and you're like, oh, well, I have these questions, then they're like, oh, you're really interesting. And then when you submit your stuff, even if you don't get it, there's an awareness of who you are. And that awareness is so important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Bernie, do students have any final questions?
I'm just curious about throughout your practice and throughout your life, what do you do to keep your peace, to stay sane through everything that goes on in this world?
So what do I do? One, I love the work that I'm doing, even though I get frustrated in moments. So I'm never like, I won't say never, because sometimes I'm like, oh my God, why am I doing this? But like, I love the work, so it feels good. I like ice cream, so ice cream is good. I do yoga, so that's helpful. And I watch really bad, not always really bad, but really bad movies on Netflix. So the badder sometimes the better. Um, but yeah, and sci-fi, like Sci-Fi Channel has like awful movies. So that's what I do for to like de-stress.
Jonell, do you have any final advice for students, just overall, whether they want to do public art or even go into your profession of curation?
I think the biggest thing is to know what you want to do and what you don't want to do, right? So like that like I thought I wanted to do this. Like that's been so many times in my life. I'm like, nah, I really don't want to do that. And like accept that because that is like value, that is gold. And once you are be open to kind of going down the path, right? Because like everything is not going to work out all the time. But if you know that this is where you are and what you're shooting for, you know, I think pushing through is important. And always remember that there are people that are around you that will completely support you in the work that you're doing. So, ask questions like, find if you need to find somebody to like complain with, right? We all should have those friends that you can just like, verbally dump your problems and then like regather and move forward. I think that's really important. Um, and I do think that making connections along the way is super, super important. Even if it's like I'm thinking about like going to grad school or I'm not thinking about going to grad school, like where can I fit in or what can I do? I think having those conversations with people are really critical. And don't assume that people you think are inaccessible are actually inaccessible. Because I know a lot of folks who are just like, people think they're like mean and stodgy and serious, and they're not, right? You're just like, I need your help. And oftentimes they will be willing to help. So those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you so much. This session has been so amazing. And I've certainly learned a lot and just really appreciate your expertise and advice for all of the students. Students, feel free to connect with Jonell. I put her LinkedIn profile in the chat. So feel free to connect with her. And I'll also have this video up on our YouTube channel. If you missed some of it, you can rewatch it and see some of the presentation that she gave earlier. It'll be on our Arts, Media, and Design YouTube channel. Jonell, thank you so much. This has been extremely helpful. We're so glad that you were able to join us today.
Thank you. It's been fun. And for real, like if you want to talk, just reach out. I'm around. So thank you.